For more than a century, the Vanderbilt name carried a singular presence in American life, rooted in railroads, punctuated by grand country estates, and framed by an architectural vision that helped define the ambitions of the Gilded Age. Socially, the family once stood at the center of society's fiercest rivalries, battles over lineage, taste, and the right to define American aristocracy. But as the family grew, so did the pressures, and the generations who followed stepped into an inheritance both luminous and demanding. There were grand estates to maintain, a public eager for stories, and a family legacy that carried obligations as heavy as the fortune itself. Consequently, layered above it all were the excesses that marked the Gilded Age itself: lavish seasons of spending, indulgent habits, and displays of wealth that often strained even the largest fortunes. Today we trace the surviving branches of the Vanderbilt family as they move through a very different America, some stepping into public life, others preserving the last great houses, and many choosing quieter paths far from the spotlight. The American Gilded Age was less an era than an opera, a spectacle of ambition sung by men whose names became institutions. Andrew Carnegie, the self-fashioned philosopher of capital, forged steel into destiny, then scattered his fortune to test whether his heirs could build rather than inherit greatness. Jay Gould, a virtuoso of speculation, commanded the railroads with a brilliance both feared and begrudged. His legend, however, proved less durable than his ledgers. Yet no dynasty captured the paradox of American wealth more than the Vanderbilts, a family name synonymous with both the heights of American prosperity and the depths of financial recklessness. Most Vanderbilt descendants have had to rebuild from nothing, yet there exists a notable exception. Indeed, this one branch of that lineage refused extinction. In the green hush of North Carolina's mountains, a quieter discipline took root. Guided by foresight and restraint, the Cecils, Vanderbilts by blood and temperament, transformed inheritance into endurance. And thus, in today's episode of Old Money Empires, we learn how one branch of America's most extravagant dynasty learned the rare art of preservation as we describe For many, the name Vanderbilt has long been shorthand for the classic rags to riches, then back to rags tale, yet that easy cliche conceals a more complicated truth. Not all Vanderbilts vanished into the fog of squandered inheritance. In fact, a few, quietly and effectively, continued to build. Take, for instance, the family's most enduring symbol, the Biltmore Estate. Nestled among the rolling hills of Asheville, North Carolina, the Biltmore remains the largest private home in the United States. Constructed between 1889 and 1895 in the French Renaissance style by George Washington Vanderbilt II, the estate sprawls across 8,000 acres, encompassing 250 rooms of near mythic scale and design. Today, its estimated worth exceeds $300 million, a monument to an era of unrestrained imagination and industrial power. And unlike so many of their contemporaries, the descendants of George Vanderbilt managed to hold on to their inheritance. The estate is still firmly under the stewardship of the Vanderbilt line, specifically through the family of George's grandson, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil. Following the passing of William A.V. Cecil Sr. and his wife Mary Mimi Cecil in 2017, their two children, William A.V. Bill Cecil Jr. and Diana Deanie Cecil Pickering, took the helm. Born in Asheville on the 17th of August, 1928, William Cecil Sr. was the youngest son of Cornelia Vanderbilt Cecil and John Amherst Cecil, a man of British nobility. His upbringing was characteristically cosmopolitan, educated in England and Switzerland, serving in the British Navy during the Second World War, and graduating from Harvard in 1952 before a brief career in finance with Chase Manhattan Bank. In 1957, he married Mary Mimi Ryan, a sharp-minded Wall Street attorney who also happened to be a first cousin of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And by 1960, the couple had returned to Asheville with a shared purpose: to breathe new life into the Biltmore estate and, by extension, the Vanderbilt name itself. But their task was formidable. The estate had fallen into disrepair, burdened by the financial realities of the mid-20th century. Yet William Cecil approached it not as a relic of past glory, but as a living enterprise. His revival was pragmatic, hands-on, and quietly visionary. He and Mimi personally oversaw marketing materials, posed for brochure photographs, and cultivated partnerships that positioned the Biltmore not as a museum of excess, but as a cornerstone of regional tourism. And the effort paid off. By 1969, for the first time in decades, the estate turned a profit, transforming Asheville into one of the South's most sought-after destinations. And Mimi Cecil was far more than a supportive spouse. Her intellect and managerial insight became essential to the estate's evolution, complementing her husband's entrepreneurial drive. Together, they embodied a form of modern stewardship that transcended nostalgia, rooted in history but unafraid of adaptation. Their greatest legacy, however, may well be their children. Bill Cecil Jr. now serves as CEO of the Biltmore Company, while his sister, Deanie Pickering, presides as the chair of the board. Under their guidance, the estate has continued to thrive, attracting more than 1.4 million visitors each year, a living monument not only to Gilded Age ambition, but to the quiet perseverance of the family behind it. Yet for every success like this one, there were countless others in the Vanderbilt lineage that ended quite differently. While the Cecils of Asheville rose to prominence through discipline and reinvention, other branches of the family tree descended into the genteel obscurity that often follows old wealth. Now, to understand how one Vanderbilt lineage endured while others dissipated, we must first turn back the clock to the age when fortune was born. Now, to understand how one branch of the Vanderbilt fortune fragmented and how one managed to endure, we must first trace the origins of that extraordinary ascent. It began, as so many American myths do, with one man of uncommon will. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known simply as the Commodore, embodied the self-made American archetype. From a humble ferry operator, he built an empire of ships and railroads so vast that by the time of his death, his fortune, worth the modern equivalent of more than $100 billion, had few equals in history. Now, Vanderbilt's approach to business was both parts aggression and austerity, rather than squander them. His discipline extended to his family life, where he instilled in his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, a rigorous sense of duty and frugality. It was an education that bore results. Despite early doubts about his competence, William's performance exceeded every expectation. Under his command, the family's railroads flourished, and the fortune his father left him did not merely survive, it doubled. When William died, the Vanderbilt coffers had swelled from $100 million to $200 million, or roughly $6 billion in today's currency, all amassed in an era untouched by federal income tax. But vast fortunes seldom survived their founders unscathed. The Vanderbilt story soon became a case study in the perils of inheritance, a saga of inherited luxury and vanishing restraint. William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of William's sons, and his wife Alva epitomized this transformation. Alva, an ambitious socialite of unshakable conviction, was determined to secure the family's place within the highest circles of New York society, no matter the cost. Her 1883 masquerade ball, hosted to christen their new Fifth Avenue mansion, was said to have cost more than $250,000, over $8 million in modern terms, lavished upon a single evening. It worked. The event became legend, cementing the Vanderbilts as the peak of Gilded Age grandeur. A later generation continued the spectacle. Florence Adele Vanderbilt, another of William Henry's children, was profiled in Collier's magazine in 1946 for her staggering extravagance. She owns 15 automobiles, the article noted, pays for her chef $25,000 a year, and keeps 100 servants across her estates. Her New York mansion, boasting 70 rooms, had become a gilded echo of a bygone age. Against this backdrop of theatrical spending, one Vanderbilt pursued a different path. George Washington Vanderbilt II, born in 1862, inherited the family's aesthetic sensibility, but not its appetite for ostentation. Quiet, studious, and refined, George turned his ambitions toward culture, art, and education rather than commerce. Yet his vision of beauty was no less grand. Captivated by the pastoral landscapes of Asheville, North Carolina, he conceived what would become the Biltmore Estates, a project that fused European refinement with American audacity. Now, the very name Biltmore, combining his Dutch ancestral home de Bilt with the Anglo-Saxon moor, meaning moorland, combined the very essence of heritage and their modern setting. Between 1889 and 1895, Biltmore spanned more than 125,000 acres and integrated over 700 parcels of land. George enlisted architect Richard Morris Hunt, a master of the Beaux-Arts style, and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, famed designer of Central Park. The result was a masterpiece of the American Gilded Age, a mansion that cost $5 million to build, more than $200 million in today's value. When the estate opened on Christmas Eve of 1895, it was less than a house than a declaration. Its guest list included writers such as Edith Wharton and Henry James, diplomats Joseph Choate and Lars Anderson, and even U.S. presidents. 3 years later, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris, a union that blended Old World lineage with American distinction. Their daughter, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, was born in 1900 within the Louis XIV room of the Biltmore, a child of privilege raised amid gardens, galleries, and grandeur. Yet for all of its brilliance, the Vanderbilt saga remained cyclical. Wealth was earned, wealth was enjoyed, and then wealth was imperiled. The story of the Biltmore would soon hinge on Cornelia herself, whose tumultuous life would imperil the estate, yet ultimately secure its survival in a most unexpected way. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt grew up surrounded by a world few could imagine. Her childhood unfolded within the gilded halls of the Biltmore estate, the grand creation of her father, George Washington Vanderbilt II. As the only child of George and Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, Cornelia's upbringing reflected the ideals of privilege tempered by culture. Her early years were spent among tutors, gardens, and art, and she accompanied her parents on extended tours across Europe, where she absorbed a sense of refinement that seemed inseparable from her family name. That charmed existence changed abruptly in 1914, when George Vanderbilt died unexpectedly, leaving 13-year-old Cornelia and her mother to manage a property whose scope would challenge even seasoned industrialists. Edith, perceptive and pragmatic, recognized the burden that maintaining such an estate represented in a changing America. Now, in 1917, just as the newly imposed federal income tax started to ravage the fortunes of Gilded Age families, she sold 68,000 acres of Biltmore land to the U.S. Forest Service. The sale, inspired by her late husband's vision of scientific forestry, helped establish the Pisgah National Forest, and in doing so, safeguarded both the estate's financial future and its environmental legacy. In 1924, Cornelia married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a member of British nobility whose lineage traced to the Marquess of Salisbury. Their wedding at All Souls Church, followed by a reception in the banquet hall of Biltmore House, symbolized a transatlantic union of wealth and heritage. Together, Cornelia and John faced new challenges brought by the Great Depression. In 1930, with Asheville's economy faltering, they made a bold decision, opening Biltmore House to the public. The move was both practical and prescient. It generated revenue, it provided jobs, and it transformed the estate into a living museum of American ambition. Its doors no longer reserved for the privileged few, but for a nation eager to glimpse its grandeur. Yet behind the estate's success, Cornelia's own life was unsettled. In 1934, she divorced John Cecil and moved to Europe, leaving behind the house that had defined her legacy. John remained at Biltmore's bachelor's wing until his death in 1954, maintaining the estate with quiet dignity. Their eldest son, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, assumed oversight briefly, while the younger, William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, returned in the late 1950s to lead the estate into its modern era. You see, William Cecil was more than a caretaker. He was a strategist with the mind of a financier and the instincts of a builder. Born in 1928, educated in England, Switzerland, and later Harvard, he served in the British Navy during World War II before joining Chase Manhattan Bank. His marriage in 1957 to Mary Lee Mimi Ryan, a Wall Street lawyer and first cousin of Jacqueline Onassis, connected the Vanderbilts to yet another strand of American aristocracy. When the Cecils moved back to Asheville in 1960, the estate was in precarious condition, majestic but unprofitable, burdened by maintenance costs and fading relevance. William saw potential where others saw decay. With a banker's discipline and an entrepreneur's foresight, he reimagined Biltmore not as a relic, but as an enterprise. He revitalized its dairy operations, diversified its agriculture, and opened new revenue streams through hospitality and tourism. In 1963, he secured the estate's designation as a National Historic Landmark, anchoring it firmly in the nation's cultural consciousness. But perhaps his most visionary move came in 1985, when he launched the Biltmore Winery, a venture that transformed the estate into a destination for both history and taste. The winery became one of America's most successful, and with it, Biltmore's financial future was secured. By the 1990s, William began transferring responsibility to the next generation. His son, William A.V. Bill Cecil Jr., assumed leadership as CEO, while his daughter, Diana Deanie Cecil Pickering, took on the role of board chair. Together, they expanded the Biltmore experience with additions like the Inn on Biltmore Estate and the Village Hotel, extending the family's hospitality tradition into the 21st century. Under their stewardship, the Biltmore transformed into heritage landmark and a thriving enterprise. Under their stewardship, the Biltmore transformed into a heritage landmark and a thriving enterprise. Each year, over 1.4 million visitors walk its grounds, not merely to marvel at its architecture, but to witness a rare continuity of American legacy. The younger generation, Ryan and Aubrey Cecil, along with Chase Pickering, now carry that legacy forward. Ryan oversees investment strategy as Director of Investments at Lioncrest Capital. Aubrey manages the estate's attraction division, and Chase directs its marketing and hospitality initiatives, particularly Antler Hill Village, home to the celebrated winery. To preserve the family's values amidst expansion, Deanie Pickering introduced a family charter, a document outlining the principles of stewardship, accountability, and collaboration. The Biltmore today stands not only as a triumph of architecture, but as a rebuke to the narrative of inevitable old money families' decline. The family now convenes twice a year for strategic meetings, blending the warmth of tradition with the rigor of corporate governance. These gatherings have evolved into what they call a family council, a structure that includes both kin and trusted advisors. Its purpose is not merely to manage assets, but to protect an ethos, the sense that Biltmore is both inheritance and obligation. More than a century after George Vanderbilt opened his mansion's doors, the Cecils continue to embody the paradox of old money reimagined. They preserve the past, not by encasing it in amber, but by allowing it to breathe, transforming stone and soil into a living institution. Where so many fortunes dissolved into nostalgia, this branch of the Vanderbilt family achieved something rarer: the alchemy of endurance. If put to the test, most people with at least a passing interest in old money dynasties in American history can name maybe 2 or 3 living Vanderbilt family members. The CNN anchor everyone recognizes, the tragic brother who died young, and perhaps the operators of the massive Biltmore estate in North Carolina that tourists visit by the thousands. What almost nobody realizes is that there were secret Vanderbilt heirs living today who don't carry the famous surname, who carved out ordinary middle-class lives far removed from Manhattan society pages. Indeed, their existence reveals something profound about how American aristocracy actually works in the 21st century, and often surnames matter more than bloodlines in preserving dynasty identity. Yes, you remove the last name and you effectively vanish from the historical record, even when your mother's maiden name once meant American royalty. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Empires, we reveal the forgotten Vanderbilts who escaped the family curse by accident of naming, built lives of remarkable normalcy despite their heritage, and prove that sometimes the only way to survive a famous family is to ensure nobody knows you're part of it. If we were to ask you about the Vanderbilt family today and individual members, you might come up with 3 names, maybe even 4, but it's a far cry from when that surname was synonymous with American royalty. First would be Anderson Cooper, of course, that iconic silver-haired CNN anchor with a reputation for calm, measured reporting. Indeed, the man who spent most of his career avoiding any mention of his famous lineage preferred to let people think his last name might as well have been Smith. Only after becoming a father and losing his mother in 2019 did he embrace the family history, co-authoring a best-selling book about the dynasty with historian Catherine Howe. He carries his father Wyatt Cooper's last name, not Vanderbilt, which helped him dodge the association for years. Then there's the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina. George Washington Vanderbilt II's 250-room cottage remains the largest privately owned home in the United States. The estate somehow survived when almost every other Vanderbilt mansion got demolished or turned into museums. The Cecil family runs it now, George's descendants through his daughter Cornelia, who married into British nobility. They've turned it into a tourism empire, hosting over 1 million visitors annually and generating roughly $207 million in revenue as of 2016. Wine tastings, seasonal festivals, hotels, restaurants, all while preserving the mansion's original grandeur. The more tragic-minded might recall Carter Cooper, Anderson's older brother, who jumped from the family's 14th floor Manhattan penthouse in 1988. Gloria Vanderbilt watched helplessly as her 23-year-old son fell to his end. Princeton-educated, handsome, and seemingly blessed with everything, Carter's passing at such a young age shocked everyone who knew him. The tragedy became a defining moment for both Gloria and Anderson, who was just 21 at the time. Gloria wrote about it in her 1997 book, A Mother's Story. The event later became central to the 2016 HBO documentary Nothing Left Unsaid, Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper, where mother and son discussed their shared grief. Some might even mention Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt funded it with $1 million endowment in 1873, though he never even visited the campus. He simply wanted to make a gesture toward post-Civil War reconciliation. Bishop Holland McTire convinced him that a Southern university would serve that purpose nicely. The students there today probably know more about their football team than the railroad tycoon whose name graces their diplomas. The family maintains no operational connection to the institution. What nobody mentions, however, are Gloria's other son. America knows all about Anderson and remembers the tragedy of Carter. Most folks simply do not know about the two Vanderbilt heirs still living who have a backstory as compelling as any Gilded Age scandal. To understand why two Vanderbilt heirs carry the name Stokowski instead of their mother's famous name, it requires examining the forces that shaped Gloria Vanderbilt's desperate need for independence. Without grasping how profoundly the custody trial damaged her, you can't comprehend why she would marry a suspected mobster at 17, then a conductor 42 years her senior at 21, or why one of those sons would vanish from the family for 38 years. The story of Stan and Chris Stokowski begins not with their births in the 1950s, but with their mother's traumatic childhood in the 1930s. Those who follow Vanderbilt family lore, Gloria became the poor little rich girl during a sensational custody trial. What they rarely consider is how that experience created a woman who would marry 4 times, always to men who represented escape from the world that had brutalized her as a child. Her second husband, Leopold Stokowski, would father the 2 forgotten Vanderbilt sons. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt entered the world on February 20th, 1924, already marked by tragedy. Her father, Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, had been the ultimate wasted son of privilege. On his 21st birthday alone, he reportedly lost $70,000 gambling, over $2.6 million in today's dollars. A dedicated horse breeder and gambler, he burned through his inheritance with breathtaking speed, maintaining stables, yachts, and a lifestyle his dwindling fortune couldn't support. When Gloria was just 18 months old, he died of cirrhosis at age 45, leaving his young widow virtually penniless. The 2 daughters from his marriages inherited a $5 million trust fund that had been locked away by Reginald's prudent father. This represented approximately $100 million in today's money, but it came with strings attached. Gloria's mother, also named Gloria, was only 21 when widowed. Born Gloria Morgan, she spent the 1920s living extravagantly across Europe. Paris, London. She traveled with her identical twin sister Thelma, who was then the mistress of the Prince of Wales. Young Gloria stayed behind with her nanny Emma Sullivan Caselick, whom she called Dodo. The judge administering the trust provided her mother with $4,000 monthly for the child's care, equivalent to over $70,000 today. Gloria's paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, watched with growing concern. A sculptor and founder of the Whitney Museum, Gertrude controlled $78 million and represented old Vanderbilt respectability. When Gloria came to New York in 1932 for a tonsillectomy, Gertrude invited her to recuperate at her Long Island estate. The summer visit stretched into years. Gertrude refused to return the child, and Gloria's mother's allowance was stopped since her daughter was no longer in her care. On October 1st, 1934, the battle erupted in Manhattan Surrogate Court. For 7 brutal weeks, Depression-era Americans, struggling to feed their own families, became transfixed with tales of European villas, titled lovers, and a $4,000 monthly allowance for one child's care. Newspapers ran special editions. Radio broadcasters interrupted programs with updates. The trial became known as the Trial of the Century, competing with the Lindbergh kidnapping for headline space. Nanny testified that Gloria's mother spent no time with her daughter. French maid Martha Callot delivered explosive testimony about witnessing Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt with Lady Milford Haven kissing her just like a lover. The press christened 10-year-old Gloria the poor little rich girl. On the witness stand, the terrified child said she wanted to stay with Aunt Gertrude. Only decades later would Gloria reveal that Gertrude's lawyer had coached her on exactly what to say. Life with Aunt Gertrude proved a different kind of prison. Gloria lived in opulent surroundings but under constant surveillance, forbidden from normal childhood friendships, treated more like a valuable artwork than a child. She attended a succession of elite schools but found no warmth, No affection, only the cold satisfaction of Gertrude having won her prize. The damage ran deep, creating a young woman desperate for love, validation, and above all, escape from anyone who might control her. At 17, Gloria fled to Hollywood, where she would marry a man with connections darker than any past Vanderbilt scandal. On December 28, 1941, 17-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt walked down the aisle at Santa Barbara Mission wearing a Howard Greer gown with a train stretching more than 30 feet. Actor Bruce Cabot stood as best man. Actress Carol Marcus served as bridesmaid. The bride wore Vanderbilt family pearls, and the wedding cake topper sported a miniature replica of her dress. The groom was Pascal "Pat" DiCicco, 32 years old and twice Gloria's age. Publicly, he worked as a Hollywood agent, movie producer, and Howard Hughes's press secretary. Privately, he was widely believed to be Lucky Luciano's right-hand man in Hollywood, establishing narcotics, gambling, and prostitution operations in the film industry. But it would seem Gloria had no idea who she was marrying. "I just thought he was terrific. I was crazy about him and would have married him in a minute," she later admitted. And DiCicco's past should have served as a warning. In 1932, he had married rising Hollywood star Thelma Todd. Their marriage was particularly unstable and frequently erupted in drunken brawls, one of which resulted in a broken nose for DiCicco and an emergency appendectomy for Todd. They divorced in 1934 on grounds of cruelty and incompatibility. On December 16, 1935, Thelma Todd was found dead in her car from carbon monoxide poisoning. Officers ruled it self-inflicted, but many suspected murder. Rumors swirled that mobsters connected to DiCicco, including Lucky Luciano himself, had killed her when she refused to let him use her sidewalk cafe as an illegal gambling front. DiCicco had been at the Trocadero nightclub with actress Margaret Lindsay the night before Todd's death, where he'd had a brief confrontation with his ex-wife. 2 years later, DiCicco was implicated in the death of comedian Ted Healy of Three Stooges fame. Healy allegedly died from injuries sustained in a bar fight with actor Wallace Beery, DiCicco, and cousin Albert "Cubby" Broccoli, who later produced the James Bond films. The marriage to Gloria quickly turned violent, they say. DiCicco proved to be a temperamental and abusive husband who nicknamed her Fatsy Roo and regularly beat her. "He would take my head and bang it against the wall," Gloria later revealed. "I had black eyes." In 1942, DiCicco got into a vicious argument with Columbia student boss Harry Cohn at the fashionable nightclub 21, chasing him into the street while shocked patrons watched. He brutally beat Gloria while muttering the name Thelma over and over. On January 26, 1945, Gloria announced their separation. In April 1945, she won a divorce in Reno, Nevada, citing extreme cruelty. She was 21 years old, finally freed from both an abusive marriage and her aunt's legal control, with access to her $4.3 million trust fund. Just one day after the divorce was finalized, Gloria would marry again. And this time, her choice would shock society even more than her union with a suspected mobster. In April 1945, one day after her divorce from Pat DiCicco was finalized, Gloria Vanderbilt married Leopold Stokowski in Mexico. She was 21 years old. He was 63, a full 42 years her senior. But Leopold Anthony Stokowski was no ordinary senior citizen. Born in London in 1882, he had become the first conductor to achieve true superstar status, regarded as something of a matinee idol. His 25-year tenure with the Philadelphia Orchestra from 1912 to 1937 had transformed it into one of the world's finest ensembles. Stokowski conducted without a baton, using only his hands in a distinctive style that mesmerized audiences. Women swooned over the charismatic maestro at the Hollywood Bowl and in concert halls worldwide. Most Americans knew him from Walt Disney's groundbreaking 1940 animated film, Fantasia. He had appeared as himself, conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra and even engaging in an on-screen conversation with Mickey Mouse. He'd also starred in the 1937 film 100 Men and a Girl. "I knew him for a week and married 3 weeks later," Gloria told her son Anderson decades afterward. The whirlwind courtship suggested that Gloria was working on pure emotion and a fresh start. This was Stokowski's third marriage. He had previously wed concert pianist Olga Samara from 1911 to 1923, with whom he had a daughter, Sonia. Then came Johnson & Johnson Evangeline Brewster Johnson from 1926 to 1937, producing 2 more daughters. Gloria became stepmother to 3 women close to or older than her own age, yet the marriage made a certain cultural sense that her union with DeCicco never had. For Gloria, Stokowski represented everything that DeCicco wasn't. While DeCicco had shown no interest in her artistic talents, Stokowski actively encouraged her painting and design work. She was attending the Art Students League, developing her skills as a visual artist, and Stokowski embodied the cultured, artistic world she aspired to inhabit. And the Vanderbilt name still carried cachet in artistic circles. For Stokowski, whose previous wife had been a Johnson & Johnson heiress, marrying a Vanderbilt aligned with his elevated social position. The marriage of a famous conductor and a Vanderbilt heiress resonated in ways that Hollywood agent and mob-connected socialite never could. April 1945 marked the final month of World War II in Europe. Social conventions were in flux, and unconventional marriages that would have been scandalous a decade earlier gained acceptance. Age gap marriages, while unusual, weren't unheard of when the man was accomplished, distinguished, and well-known. The marriage would last 10 years and produce 2 sons who would carry their father's surname rather than Vanderbilt. This seemingly simple fact would have profound implications for their lives, separating them from the social expectations, media scrutiny, and historical baggage that came with their mother's name. Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski arrived on August 22, 1950, 5 years into his parents' marriage. His brother Christopher followed on January 31, 1952. Both boys entered a household unlike any other on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Their father was 68 when Stan was born, 70 when Christopher arrived. Leopold still conducted major orchestras, still commanded standing ovations, but he was older than most grandfathers at the playground. Their mother, Gloria, was 26 and 28 respectively, young enough to be mistaken for an older sister, beautiful enough to stop photographers on the street. The boys carried their father's surname, not their mother's famous one. On birth certificates, school enrollments, doctor's forms, they were Stokowskis. Therefore, the Vanderbilt lineage remained present but unspoken, like an heirloom tucked away in a drawer. They had 3 much older half-sisters from their father's previous marriages. Sonia Stokowski, born in 1921 to Leopold's first wife, was old enough to be their mother. 2 more daughters from his marriage to Johnson & Johnson heiress Evangeline Brewster Johnson completed the complex family constellation. These women had grown up in different decades, different worlds, connected to the boys only through their aging father. The marriage that produced Stan and Christopher was already showing cracks. Leopold encouraged Gloria's artistic pursuits, but he kept her socially isolated. He wanted a wife who would orbit around him, not one who might outshine him. Gloria, who had married to escape control, found herself trapped again. By 1954, when Stan was 4 and Christopher barely 2, Gloria had begun an affair with Frank Sinatra. She was 30 years old, desperate for excitement, for recognition as more than just the maestro's young wife. The affair was brief but significant. It marked Gloria's refusal to disappear into another man's shadow. The divorce came a year later in 1955. Gloria fought Leopold for custody of the boys and won, but she made a crucial decision that shaped their childhoods. She refused to allow the children to testify, sparing them the ordeal that she had endured at age 10 when Gertrude Whitney's lawyer coached her on what to say about her own mother. Stan was 5, Christopher only 3 when their parents split. They would grow up shuffling between households, between their mother's increasing fame and their father's fading glory. Their early years included time in London schools before returning to the United States, where they would navigate the peculiar challenge of being Vanderbilt heirs who didn't carry the name. In 1963, Gloria married her 4th and final husband, Wyatt Cooper. Stan was 13, Christopher 11. They would gain two more half-brothers, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper in 1965 and Anderson Hayes Cooper in 1967. 4 boys, 2 surnames, and 1 mother who had spent her life trying to escape the damage of her childhood. It is at this point in our story we'll traverse 2 very different paths. One son who would build a quiet life in the shadows, another who would disappear entirely for nearly 4 decades. Gloria Vanderbilt raised 4 boys across 2 marriages, and the contrast between the pairs revealed everything about how surnames, timing, and circumstance can shape one's destiny. Stan and Christopher Stokowski grew up as the sons of a fading classical music legend and a socialite still finding her way. By the time Anderson and Carter Cooper arrived in the mid-1960s, their mother had transformed into Gloria Vanderbilt, the designer, the artist, the brand. The older boys knew struggle, the younger ones knew only success. Leopold still lived until 1977, reaching the remarkable age of 95, but his glory days conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra were long past. The boys visited an old man who spoke of Fantasia while the world moved on to the Beatles. Anderson and Carter, by contrast, grew up in a stable household with Wyatt Cooper, a Mississippi-born writer who provided the steady father figure Gloria's older sons had lacked. While Stan and Christopher navigated the complex dynamics of elderly father and young mother, the Cooper boys had parents who functioned as a team. The surname difference mattered more than anyone anticipated. In the 1950s and early 1960s, being a Stokowski meant connections to high culture, but not necessarily high society. Being a Cooper in the 1970s, with Gloria Vanderbilt jeans selling 150,000 pairs on their very first day, meant something entirely different. Stan adapted by becoming invisible. He built friendships quietly, attended school without fanfare, and discovered he preferred landscaping to spotlights. When he reached adulthood, he chose the Hamptons over Manhattan, working with his hands rather than trading in on his heritage. But Christopher took a different path. He inherited his father's musical talents, but not his temperament for public performance. He attended Bard College, known for its art programs, and began working in classical music under an alias. The weight of being Leopold's son in that world was already heavy. Adding Vanderbilt would have become unbearable. Gloria tried to maintain connections. With Stan and Christopher, she carried the guilt of their disrupted childhood, the custody battle, the elderly father who couldn't play catch in Central Park. With Anderson and Carter, she could be the mother she always wanted to be. In 1978, 2 events shattered whatever equilibrium the family had achieved. Wyatt Cooper died suddenly during heart surgery, leaving 10-year-old Anderson and 13-year-old Carter fatherless. The same year, Christopher, then 26, abruptly severed all contact with the family after Gloria's therapist allegedly interfered in his engagement to April Sandmeyer. Stan remained, building his landscaping business, maintaining his relationship with Gloria, watching his younger half-brothers cope with tragedy. But Christopher vanished completely, beginning an estrangement that would last 38 years. The 4 sons of Gloria Vanderbilt, 2 Stokowskis, 2 Coopers, illustrated how the same mother could produce entirely different destinies. But only 3 of them would gather at her funeral in 2019. In 1976, Gloria Vanderbilt did something that no other Vanderbilt had done in generations. She worked for a living. At 52, she partnered with manufacturer Mohan Murjani to launch designer jeans with her signature embroidered on the back pocket and a swan logo on the front. The first commercial aired during a soap opera. Within hours, 150,000 pairs sold out completely. Department stores couldn't stock them fast enough. By 1980, the brand was generating $200 million in annual sales. Gloria had created the first designer denim line, marketed directly to consumers through aggressive advertising. The jeans expanded into blouses, dresses, accessories, fragrances, and home goods. At its peak, the Gloria Vanderbilt brand was reportedly worth $100 million. "I'm not knocking inherited money," she said in 1985, "but the money I've made has a reality to me that inherited money doesn't have." Anderson would later echo this sentiment, calling inherited wealth an initiative sucker and a curse. The empire wouldn't last forever. By the late 1980s, competition from other designer labels eroded her fashion income. Gloria sued her former business partners and lawyer for fraud, winning a $1.7 million judgment she never collected. She was forced to sell her homes to pay back taxes that her lawyer had failed to pay to the IRS. Through it all, her relationships with her 4 sons evolved differently. Stan maintained steady contact, building his landscape business while staying close to his mother. He occasionally appeared at her exhibitions and premieres, comfortable in the background. Christopher remained completely estranged after 1978. Gloria told The Telegraph in 2004, "When Carter died, I thought he would come back, but he didn't. And we respect his wishes." She refused to reveal his whereabouts, but clearly never stopped thinking about him. Carter's taking of his own life on July 22, 1988, devastated the family. She wrote about it in her 1997 book, A Mother's Story, trying to make sense of the senseless. Anderson famously threw himself into journalism, building a career that would eventually surpass even his mother's fame. He became CNN's star anchor, earning $11 million annually, carefully avoiding mentions of his Vanderbilt heritage until later in life. The 2016 HBO documentary Nothing Left Unsaid, Gloria Vanderbilt and Anderson Cooper changed everything. Though it barely mentioned Christopher out of respect for his privacy, it sparked renewed interest in the missing son. Christopher reached out, finally, through April Sandmeyer, his former fiancée, and reunited with the family after 38 years. Gloria saw Christopher 3 times before her death. Stan appeared in the documentary, speaking with Anderson about their mother and their complicated family history. For a brief moment, all 4 sons were connected again, if not together. When Gloria died on June 17, 2019, at age 95 from stomach cancer, she left behind an estate valued at approximately $1.5 million, far less than the $200 million many expected. Her will would reveal one last surprise about how she valued each son's place in her life. When Gloria Vanderbilt's will was filed in Manhattan Surrogate's Court in 2019, the numbers stunned even jaded estate lawyers. The woman, widely reported to be worth $200 million, left an estate valued at approximately $1.5 million. The distribution revealed Gloria's final statement on her 4 sons' places in her life. Leopold Stan Stokowski received her co-op apartment at 30 Beekman Place in Manhattan, valued at approximately $1.2 million. Anderson Cooper received all the rest of the estate, estimated at less than $1.5 million. Christopher Stokowski received nothing. He wasn't even mentioned in the will. The co-op Stan inherited came with monthly maintenance fees of $4,311. Anderson later sold both it and Gloria's ground floor studio apartment to producer Amy Pascal for a combined $3.5 million, $2.5 million for the main residence, and $950,000 for the studio, more than double the original asking prices. Today, Stan Stokowski continues operating New Ground Gardens LLC from Sag Harbor, New York. At 74, he remains married to Emily Goldstein and maintains his status as a certified advanced organic land care professional. His estimated net worth of between $1 to $5 million comes from decades of landscaping, but not inheritance. His daughter Aurora has carved out her own path, co-founding Fair Folks and a Goat, a retail gallery and tea salon on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Now, the Stokowski line continues, professionally, quietly, without fanfare. Christopher Stokowski, now 72, reportedly lives off his late father Leopold's estate, which still generates income from music royalties. Various sources estimate his net worth at approximately $1 million from his music career, performed under an alias. His exclusion from Gloria's will wasn't explained in the legal documents, though sources suggested it reflected both the decades of estrangement and his expressed desire to remain separate from the family's public life. Anderson Cooper has built an empire that would impress even the Commodore. His net worth exceeds $100 million, earned through his $11 million annual CNN salary and careful investments. In 2020, he welcomed son Wyatt Morgan Cooper via surrogate, named after the father he lost at age 10. A second son, Sebastian Luke Maisani Cooper, followed in 2022. Anderson has been explicit about inheritance. He doesn't believe in passing wealth onto children without them earning it themselves. The Vanderbilt fortunes collapse across 5 generations, from 200 billion to 1.5 million, taught him that unearned wealth corrodes ambition. The Stokowski brothers represent a fascinating footnote in the Vanderbilt saga. They are legitimate heirs who chose different paths, Stan building quietly in the shadows, Christopher vanishing into them. Their surnames spared them the burden of public expectation, while their bloodline connected them to American history. 4 sons, 2 surnames, 1 mother who spent her life escaping the trauma of being the poor little rich girl. In the end, Gloria's greatest inheritance that she passed on wasn't money, but the lesson she gave each of her sons. Build your own life, because even the greatest fortune could get lost in one generation. The great fortunes of America rarely disappear overnight. Instead, they often diminish gradually, each generation spending more than it earns, selling more than it acquires, until only the buildings remain as witnesses to former glory. Of all the dynasties that defined America's Gilded Age, none rose higher or fell harder than the Vanderbilts. Their name, once synonymous with railroad monopolies and staggering wealth, had become by the 21st century something else entirely, a study in how quickly fortune can turn to misfortune. In August 2018, this long decline reached its most humiliating chapter when the last Vanderbilt descendants in the Breakers received an eviction notice from their ancestral home. The Breakers, that 70-room palace overlooking the Atlantic in Newport, Rhode Island, had housed 4 generations of the family's branch. Now, the Preservation Society, charged with protecting the mansion, had decided the family itself was no longer welcome. How the Vanderbilts came to be expelled from their own creation reveals more than simple financial failure. It exposes the particularly American pattern of wealth through ruthlessness and lost through carelessness, of empires built by titans and squandered by their children. Today on Old Money Mansions, we tell this remarkable story of reversal. How the family that once controlled more wealth than the U.S. Treasury ended up getting kicked out of their own house. Most Americans who tour the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island today have no idea that until very recently, actual Vanderbilts lived upstairs, while visitors below marveled at the breakfast room's platinum walls and the Great Hall's painted ceiling. The great-great-grandchildren of Cornelius Vanderbilt II were making coffee in their 3rd-floor apartment, paying a symbolic rent of $1 per year. It was an arrangement that seemed destined to continue forever, a living link between past and present that gave the mansion something no other Gilded Age museum could claim. In the mid-1800s, Cornelius Vanderbilt, better known to New York's elite and its working poor as the Commodore, transformed a sharp business instinct into the foundation of America's greatest transportation empire. After years of distinguished service with Thomas Gibbons's steamship operation, Vanderbilt struck out on his own with a strategy both simple and ruthless. He undercut his rivals with fares so low they had no choice but to pay him to leave their routes, a practice that made him rich and his competitors desperate. But his dominance over the waterways was merely the opening act. As the 1860s began, the Commodore turned his attention to the iron rails that were stitching America together. He acquired the Hudson River Railroad, then seized control of the New York Central Railroad in a hostile takeover that left Wall Street stunned. Not content with these prizes, he added the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway to his empire. These weren't mere business transactions. They were conquests that reshaped the economic geography of a nation. By his death in 1877, the Vanderbilt fortune stood virtually without rival, the Commodore's name carved in the very backbone of American commerce. Yet to understand the Vanderbilt legacy solely through ledgers and stock certificates would be to miss half of the story. The family's ambitions extended beyond commerce into stone and mortar, creating monuments to their wealth that would outlast the fortune itself. Consider the Biltmore estate, George Washington Vanderbilt II's 250-room colossus nestled in North Carolina's Asheville Mountains. Constructed with Indiana limestone across a footprint stretching 365 feet, it remains America's largest private residence, a Gilded Age fantasy rendered in perfect architectural detail. The stories those particular walls could tell would make even the most jaded socialite blush, which is why we save the juiciest tales for our free Substack newsletter, which you can access by clicking the first link in the video description. But the Vanderbilt architectural legacy found its most dramatic expression in Newport, Rhode Island. There, on Ochre Point Avenue, rose the Breakers, commissioned as a summer retreat for Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The renowned architect Richard Morris Hunt began work in 1893, completing the mansion in 1895. Drawing inspiration from the Renaissance palaces of Genoa and Turin, the Breakers announced itself as something unprecedented on American shores. Its limestone and brick facade housed a great hall soaring 50 feet in every direction, a space designed to humble visitors with its sheer scale. When the Breakers emerged from the ashes of its fire-damaged predecessor in 1895, it represented more than architectural ambition. It stood as the supreme expression of Vanderbilt dominance. Yet by the 1920s, the first cracks in the foundation were already showing. The once bottomless Vanderbilt wealth, divided among heirs with expensive tastes and limited business sense, as the Great Depression approached, the family's control over their empire loosened. They found themselves navigating a new financial world, one where old money no longer guaranteed perpetual power. The mansions remained, magnificent and immovable, but the fortune that built them was already beginning its long retreat. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, America discovered a new way for preserving its architectural past. This movement had deep roots, stretching back to the 19th century when concerned citizens fought to save the homes of founding fathers John Hancock and George Washington from demolition. Those early battles sparked a national debate that would define the next century. Should historical buildings be preserved at any cost, or should economic progress take precedence? Into this debate stepped organizations like the Preservation Society of Newport County, Rhode Island, a group of civic-minded individuals determined to save the past from the wrecking ball. Catherine and George Warren founded the society in 1945, initially calling it the Georgian Society with a specific mission in mind. They aimed to protect Hunter House, a Georgian colonial masterpiece overlooking Newport Harbor, from developers eager to tear it down for something more profitable. Against this backdrop, the Breakers Mansion at 44 Ochre Point Avenue faced its own crossroads. Built as Cornelius Vanderbilt II's summer palace, by 1945, the estate had evolved from a private family retreat into an object of intense public fascination. The turning point came when Gladys Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's youngest daughter and the estate's guardian since 1934, made a decision that would change everything. With a pragmatic eye toward both preservation and financial necessity, she opened the Breakers' doors to the public in 1948. This wasn't simply about displaying the mansion's splendor to curious visitors. Gladys understood that ticket sales could help maintain the enormous property while supporting the Preservation Society's broader mission. The arrangement took the form of what amounted to a gentleman's handshake, charging the symbolic sum of $1 per year. This allowed the Preservation Society to manage the Breakers as a public museum, while Gladys retained her private apartment on the third floor. It represented an elegant compromise. Private residence above, public spectacle below. The Breakers quickly transformed into a pilgrimage site for Americans fascinated by the excesses and ambitions of the Gilded Age. Thousands filed through its rooms each year, gaping at the platinum-leafed breakfast room and the hand-painted ceilings that spoke of an era when money seemed limitless. But beneath this harmonious arrangement, tensions were already building. The Vanderbilt heirs, who had initially welcomed the partnership as a way to preserve their heritage, began to eye the Preservation Society's growing influence with concern. What started as a mutually beneficial arrangement would gradually reveal fundamental differences in how each party viewed the Breakers' future. The descendants saw a family home that happened to welcome visitors. The Preservation Society increasingly viewed it as a public trust where the family happened to live. As the decades passed, these competing visions would set the stage for a confrontation that neither the Vanderbilts nor the Society's founders could have imagined. The year 1972 marked a fundamental shift in the Breakers' long history when the Preservation Society of Newport County made an offer the Vanderbilt heirs couldn't refuse. For $366,000, roughly $2.4 million in today's currency, the Society would purchase the entire mansion outright. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary bargain for 70 rooms of Gilded Age magnificence on Newport's most prestigious avenue. Yet this transaction involved more than just money exchanging hands. The deal came with an understanding, written into the very spirit if not the letter of the agreement, that the Vanderbilt presence would continue within the breakers' walls. Countess Anthony Chapati, Gladys's heir, retained her residence after the sale. When she eventually departed, her children, Gladys and Paul Chapati, moved into the third-floor apartments, maintaining the family's unbroken connection to the mansion their great-grandfather had built. Their presence served as more than mere symbolism. They weren't distant relatives making occasional ceremonial appearances, but direct descendants who called the breakers home. They occupied what had once been servants' quarters, now converted into private apartments, living quiet lives above the daily parade of tourists. But the Vanderbilt descendants viewed this new arrangement with mixed emotions. While they appreciated the Preservation Society's dedication to maintaining the property, friction soon emerged over fundamental questions of stewardship. The family began to notice what they perceived as a troubling attitude toward Vanderbilt artifacts and heirlooms. Items that held deep personal meaning were sometimes treated as mere museum pieces, their emotional significance subordinated to their display value. Whispers circulated around the family about creeping commercialization, about the society prioritizing visitor numbers over historical authenticity. The society staff, the descendants felt, occasionally displayed an unfortunate tendency to minimize the family's ongoing connection to the property. Meanwhile, the 1980s brought new financial pressures that strained the already delicate relationship. The Vanderbilt fortune, once seemingly infinite, had dwindled to a fraction of its former glory. Maintaining their presence at the breakers became increasingly dependent on the Preservation Society's goodwill. The descendants found themselves in an uncomfortable position, living in a home their family had built, guests in their own ancestral mansion. The Preservation Society, for its part, faced mounting costs for maintaining the aging property. Every year brought new repairs, new expenses, new challenges in keeping a Gilded Age palace functioning as a modern museum. What had begun as a partnership between family and preservationists was becoming something more fraught, a relationship where gratitude mixed with resentment, where the meaning of preservation itself was up for debate. At the dawn of 1998, the breakers appeared to exemplify a rare success story in American preservation. The mansion stood as magnificent as ever, its rooms meticulously maintained, its grounds precise. More remarkably still, Paul and Gladys Chapati, great-grandchildren of the legendary Cornelius Vanderbilt II, continued to reside in their third-floor quarters. The Preservation Society's board president that year even put the arrangement in writing, noting how valuable it was to tell visitors that the original owner's great-great-grandchildren continued to live in the house. It gave the tours an authenticity that no amount of period furniture or costumed guides could replicate. Paul and Gladys weren't merely tenants clinging to faded glory. Both served on the board of trustees, contributing their time to fundraising events, and shared family stories with researchers and visitors alike. They understood their unique position as living bridges between the breakers' past and present. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade, the relationship was beginning to fracture. The death of their mother, Countess Anthony Chapati, marked a subtle but significant change in dynamics. Without her presence as the last direct link to Gladys Vanderbilt, the younger Chapatis found their position increasingly precarious. They began to sense a change in how the Preservation Society viewed them, less as partners in preservation, more as relics themselves. Their contribution to the mansion's operations seemed to carry less weight in board discussions. Their suggestions about maintaining family traditions were politely acknowledged, but seemed to be quietly ignored. The warning came with chilling directness from the board president. Their occupancy, he made clear, hung by the thinnest of threads. One wrong move, one moment of discord, and they could find themselves on the street. It was hardly the kind of thing one said to valued partners in preservation. Then came the flashpoint that would ultimately seal their fate. The Preservation Society unveiled plans for a modern facility that would process the ever-growing crowds more efficiently. To Paul and Gladys, it represented everything wrong with the Society's evolving priorities. The visitor center would fundamentally alter the estate's carefully preserved grounds. It would transform the breakers from a glimpse into Gilded Age life into something more akin to a theme park. They opposed it publicly and vocally, invoking their family's legacy and their great-grandfather's vision. The Rhode Island Supreme Court heard their arguments in 2018. The justices listened to passionate pleas about historical integrity and architectural heritage. In the end, they ruled in favor of progress, or at least in favor of the Preservation Society's definition of it, and the visitor center could proceed. The Vanderbilt descendants had lost their influence over the estate their family had created. On August 7, 2018, the inevitable arrived in the form of an eviction notice. After decades of residency, Paul and Gladys Chapare were told to vacate their ancestral home. The official reason cited antiquated plumbing and safety concerns in the third-floor apartments. But everyone understood the real message. The family's time at the breakers had come to an end. By 2019, the breakers had completed its transformation from living mansion to static museum. No Vanderbilt descendants walked its halls. No family members occupied the upper floors. No direct connection remained to the people who had built and inhabited this palace by the sea. The mansion now belonged entirely to the public realm. Where once Gladys Chapare had walked her dog through private corridors, audio guides now directed streams of visitors through carefully marked routes. The third-floor apartments that had housed 4 generations of Vanderbilts were sealed off, their antiquated plumbing apparently dangerous for habitation, but not for the structure itself. The transformation brought undeniable benefits. More than 1.4 million visitors annually could now experience the full scope of Gilded Age excess, wandering through rooms that showcased both astronomical wealth and exquisite craftsmanship. Educational programs flourished, with the Preservation Society's lecture series, The Gilded Age Years, transforming America, drawing scholars and history enthusiasts alike. The mansion had become a teaching tool, illustrating the era's stark contrast between industrial progress and social inequality. Audio tours now narrated the stories of both the family who built the breakers and the armies of servants who maintained it. The Preservation Society had succeeded in its core mission. The breakers would stand forever as a monument to American ambition and artistry. Yet something essential had been lost in the transition. Tour guides who could once say, "The family still lives upstairs," now spoke only in the past tense. The human connection that made the breakers unique among Newport mansions had been severed. Legal battles continued to cast shadows over the mansion's public image. The Chapares and other family members pursued various actions against the Preservation Society, creating a narrative of conflict that overshadowed the building's historical significance. News coverage focused less on architectural splendor and more on lawsuits and acrimony. The new visitor center, whose construction had precipitated the family's eviction, opened to mixed reviews. While it efficiently processed the crowds and provided modern amenities, critics argued it had forever altered the estate's character. The approach to the breakers now felt more commercial than reverential. Today, the breakers stands as many things simultaneously. It remains an architectural masterpiece and a window into the Gilded Age. But it also has become a cautionary tale about the cost of turning homes into museums. And the Vanderbilt story at the breakers ended not with a bang, but with an eviction notice. The family that once commanded enough wealth to build this palace had been reduced to unwelcome tenants in their own creation.